You know, usually when we talk about winning a war, there's this expectation of cinematic momentum. We picture a map with those big sweeping arrows pushing forward.
Right, yeah.
The constant drumbeat of glorious battles and cavalry charges. It's supposed to be this active, forward-moving narrative.
It's how we prefer to consume history, I think. We want decisive action. We want the clear cause and effect of a battlefield victory where one side outmaneuvers the other, the smoke clears, and the winner claims the territory.
Yeah, exactly. But then you look at the American Revolution between, say, the summer of 1778 and the fall of 1781, and suddenly the map just stops. That cinematic momentum completely flatlines.
It really does. It just stalls out.
Right, so looking at the stack of sources we've gathered for this deep dive, and we are pulling from Washington's personal correspondence, macroeconomic data from the Continental Congress, and diaries of common soldiers.
Really fascinating primary sources, by the way.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to look at this 3-year stretch in the North. Because the reality of the war during this time wasn't glorious at all. It was an agonizing, grinding stalemate.
Yeah, it was a war of attrition, really.
We are going to unpack how the American Revolution was almost entirely lost, not by British muskets on a battlefield, but through bankruptcy and brutal winters and some truly shocking internal betrayals.
I mean, the overarching strategy during this period is critical to understand. Because after the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, George Washington fought very few major pitched battles in the North. He was actively refining what military historians call Fabian tactics.
Okay, let's unpack this concept a bit, because to a modern listener, I mean, refusing to fight just sounds like losing. What exactly is a Fabian strategy?
Well, it's named after the Roman dictator Fabius Maximus. He successfully drove Hannibal out of Italy, not by defeating him in a massive clash, but by constantly harassing him and avoiding decisive engagements.
No.
Washington realized a fundamental truth about the American Revolution, which was that the Continental Army didn't actually have to defeat the British Empire in a massive winner-take-all battle. They just had to survive.
Because the army itself was the physical symbol of American sovereignty.
Precisely. As long as the Continental Army existed in the field, the rebellion existed. If Washington risked his entire force in one massive battle and lost, well, the war was over.
Right, that makes sense.
So he deployed his forces in a massive, sprawling defensive arc around the British, who were heavily entrenched in New York City. He essentially bottled up British General Sir Henry Clinton in Manhattan.
So basically his grand strategy was just refusing to get into the ring. It sounds like a giant game of chicken. You're just staring each other down, waiting for the other guy to blink or run out of gas or just get frustrated and go home.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But the danger of playing that game of chicken is that you expose yourself to a completely different set of risks. By refusing to fight the British head-on, Washington shifted the primary existential threat away from the enemy. The danger was no longer British artillery. The danger became the environment and a completely collapsing American economy.
And the environment decided to show up in a terrifying way during the winter of 1779 to 1780. Now, when most of us think of the Revolutionary War, we think of Valley Forge.
Right, the bloody footprints in the snow.
Exactly. That is the mythic winter of the Revolution. But when you look at the actual climatological records in our sources, Valley Forge was a walk in the park compared to where the army was camped in Morristown, New Jersey.
Morristown was unequivocally the worst winter of the entire 18th century in North America. The data we have is staggering. I mean, we were talking about 28 distinct snowstorms.
28.
28, and 6 massive blinding blizzards. The temperatures dropped so low and stayed so low that every saltwater inlet from North Carolina all the way up to Canada froze over.
The sources mention that New York Harbor froze solid. And we aren't talking about a thin sheet of ice. The ice was so thick that British artillery units, heavy cannons and entire columns of troops were just marching directly across the frozen harbor from Manhattan to Staten Island.
Imagine the logistics of that for a moment. You are a Continental soldier arriving at Jockey Hollow in Morristown late in November. There's already a foot of snow on the ground. You are exhausted, you're wearing literal rags, and you have to build your own log hut in sub-zero temperatures.
Wow.
You're wading half leg deep in freezing mud and snow. Sometimes it snowed 4 feet at a single time. The drifts were 6 feet high.
Which completely obliterates the roads, meaning the supply chain just ceases to exist. There is a passage in the sources from a 19-year-old private named Joseph Plum Martin that really brings the human toll into focus.
Yeah, his diary is one of the most vital windows we have into the enlisted man's experience. During this Morristown winter, he wrote that the men were absolutely literally starved.
Just brutal.
He recorded going 4 days and 4 nights without putting a single morsel of food into his mouth. He survived by peeling a little black birch bark off a stick of wood and gnawing on it.
And that wasn't an isolated incident either. He also reported seeing soldiers roasting and eating their own old shoes.
Yeah.
General Nathaniel Greene noted in his reports that more than half the men were completely naked, meaning they lacked basic shirts and trousers, and over 2/3 were starving. There are dispatches from officers where the ink is literally freezing in their quill pens as they try to write to Congress for help.
And we even have reports of officers killing and eating their own pet dogs just to survive. The suffering was absolute.
But if you're a soldier starving to death in a frozen hut, you're looking around and wondering why the supply chain failed so spectacularly. And the answer isn't just the 6 feet of snow.
No, definitely not.
Because even when the roads were clear, the food wasn't coming. The root cause was a macroeconomic abyss.
This is where the physical reality of the war collides with the political reality of the new nation. The Continental Congress was functionally bankrupt. You have to remember, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no actual power to levy taxes.
Right.
They could request funds from the individual states, but the states rarely paid what they owed. Congress had no mechanism to raise revenue to pay for the war.
So their solution to having no money was to just invent it. They started printing fiat paper money, the continental dollar. And because it wasn't backed by gold or silver or really the promise of a functioning government, the inflation became astronomical.
To understand the scale of this hyperinflation, the wholesale price index went from 78 all the way up to 10,544.
That is just wild.
Yeah, 50 continental paper dollars were suddenly required to equal the value of a single Spanish silver dollar. This total collapse in value is where the phrase "not worth a continental" comes from.
Let's put that in perspective for someone listening today. Imagine you get your paycheck, you go to the grocery store, and a normal $5 gallon of milk suddenly costs you $600 by the time you reach the checkout line.
It's unthinkable.
Your money is evaporating in your hands. But wait, I have to push back on the logic of Congress here. If the money is literally worthless, why wouldn't they just stop printing it? Were they just closing their eyes, running the printing presses, and hoping the problem would fix itself?
They were caught in an impossible trap. If they stopped printing the paper money, they couldn't even pretend to purchase supplies, and the Continental Army would dissolve the very next day.
So it was a bluff.
Exactly. They kept printing because they hoped that the promise of future victory would eventually give the currency retrospective value. But in reality, local farmers and merchants just stopped accepting it. Earmarked funds for military supplies would completely dry up in value before the Army's quartermasters could even finalize a purchase.
If local farmers aren't accepting the money, how did the Army eat anything at all once the snow finally melted?
They were forced to issue what were called commissary certificates. Essentially, these were government IOUs. An Army detachment would show up at a local New Jersey farm, physically seize the civilians' grain, their cattle, their wagons, and hand the farmer a piece of paper from a bankrupt government promising to pay them back after the war.
You can imagine how well that went over. A farmer works all year, and an army claiming to fight for his liberty steals his livelihood and hands him worthless paper. It created massive civilian resentment.
Congress was relying entirely on George Washington's personal authority and his immense diplomatic tact to keep the local populace from turning completely hostile. Washington was constantly walking a tightrope trying to keep his men from starving without alienating the very civilians they were fighting to protect.
So you have a situation where the soldiers are freezing, they are starving, and they haven't been paid real usable money in well over a year. The psychological limits of the human beings making up this army are being pushed to the absolute breaking point.
Yeah, they were.
And Washington couldn't hold it together forever. Eventually, the foundation of the Continental Army started cracking from the inside out.
We see this eruption of deep discontent in the mutinies of 1781. On January 1st, the Pennsylvania line, which was camped near Morristown, officially mutinied. Roughly 2,400 enlisted men seized their weapons, defied their officers, and claimed their 3-year enlistment terms had expired.
Wow, that is a massive portion of the army.
It really was. And it was not a peaceful protest. It was incredibly violent at the start. An American officer, Captain Adam Bidding, was shot and killed by his own men.
The mutineers march out of camp, heading toward Princeton, demanding back pay, adequate clothing, and their discharges. Washington is watching this unfold from his headquarters with intense anxiety. But when you look at the sources, there is this wild psychological paradox at play with these mutineers.
It is a fascinating dynamic. The troops are in armed rebellion against Congress, and they are actively mutinying against their immediate commanding officers. But they maintain this unquestionable, almost sacred reverence for George Washington himself and for the Patriot cause overall.
We know this because of how they handled British spies. The British High Command hears about this mutiny and thinks, oh, perfect, the American army is eating itself, so they send spies into the mutineers' camp.
Right, to offer them a deal.
Exactly. They offer the starving men hard gold, decent food, and full pardons if they just defect to the British crown.
And the mutineers, who again are actively rebelling against their own government, arrest the British spies, hand them over to American authorities to be executed, and proudly declare to the world that they are not Arnold's.
Meaning they are not traitors.
Right. They wanted to be paid, but they were not going to sell out the revolution.
The Pennsylvania Mutiny is ultimately settled through a tense negotiation. Many of the men are discharged or given some back pay. But that leniency, while necessary to stop the immediate bleeding, created a very dangerous precedent.
It absolutely did.
Because just a few weeks later, on January 20th, the New Jersey line decides to run the exact same playbook. They mutiny, demanding the exact same concessions.
And this is where Washington's demeanor completely flips.
It's the escalation of boundaries. It's like dealing with a teenager who pushes the line. The first time they act out, you sit down, you negotiate, you show you're reasonable because maybe they have a point. But the second time they do it, if you don't bring the hammer down, they realize there are no rules and you lose all authority.
Washington dropped all magnanimity. He realized the cold calculus of 18th century military discipline. If he allowed a precedent of appeasing armed rebellions to take root, the entire Continental Army would dissolve into a chaotic bomb overnight.
So what does he do?
He orders a detachment of 500 deeply loyal troops to march on the New Jersey mutineers. His orders to his commanders were explicit: compel unconditional submission and grant no terms whatsoever while the mutineers had arms in their hands.
He writes this chilling line in his orders. He says the existence of the army called for an example. And the example he sets is incredibly brutal.
It really is.
The loyalist troops surround the mutineers in their sleep, force them to parade without their weapons, and Washington orders the 3 ringleaders to be executed on the spot.
And the mechanism of the execution was particularly harsh. Washington ordered that the firing squad be made up of the ringleaders' own weeping fellow mutineers.
But wait, I have to ask about the immense risk here. Executing his own starving men, wasn't Washington terrified that forcing these men to shoot their friends would just trigger a mass desertion, that the whole camp would just turn their guns on him?
It was an incredible gamble.
Right.
But Washington understood the psychology of his men better than anyone. He knew that the shared guilt and the sheer terror of that moment would reestablish the absolute hierarchy of command. It was a ruthless, calculated move, but it worked.
Wow.
It permanently quelled the spirit of mutiny in the North. The men completely despised Congress, but they submitted entirely to the gravity of Washington.
And what's wild is that while he's managing these mutinies, putting down rebellions, and dealing with the macroeconomic collapse of an entire nation, he's also trying to micromanage his personal estate via Lenners.
Oh yeah, Mount Vernon.
Right. His cousin Lund Washington is running Mount Vernon down in Virginia.
Mount Vernon was an indispensable psychological anchor for Washington. He's sitting in a frozen tin in New Jersey, writing highly detailed letters directing the planting of specific groves of trees and the repair of the estate's mills.
Just incredible compartmentalization.
But that hyperinflation we talked about was destroying his private wealth, too.
Yeah.
He's constantly writing to Lund about how the paper money is completely worthless. And then in April 1781, there's a direct physical threat to the estate.
The HMS Savage incident. A heavily armed British warship sails up the Potomac River. They are setting fire to neighboring estates, and they drop anchor right off the shore of Mount Vernon.
Too close for comfort.
Lund Washington is terrified they are going to burn the mansion to the ground. So to save the property, Lund goes aboard the British ship and gives them food provisions and supplies to appease them. And during all this chaos, 17 enslaved people at Mount Vernon use the opportunity to self-emancipate, escaping to the British ships to claim their freedom.
When word of this reaches Washington, you might expect his reaction to be one of profound relief that his beloved home wasn't reduced to ashes. Instead, his letters show he is furiously indignant. The loss of his honor completely eclipsed the preservation of his property.
He writes this blistering letter to Lund. He essentially says, I would have preferred you let them burn my house to ashes rather than commune with a parcel of plundering scoundrels.
Yeah.
For Washington, actively collaborating with the enemy to save his own wealth was the ultimate public embarrassment.
That profound sense of honor and loyalty, the idea that you never ever deal with the enemy for personal gain, is exactly why the betrayal of Benedict Arnold was such a devastating psychological blow to Washington. This happened just a few months prior in September 1780.
The name Benedict Arnold is just synonymous with treason today. But we forget that at the time, he was one of Washington's most aggressive, brilliant, and trusted battlefield commanders.
He truly was. Washington had commended Arnold's courage repeatedly. Because of that trust, Washington entrusted Arnold with the command of West Point. Now, West Point wasn't just a fort. It was the strategic linchpin of the entire war.
Right, because it sits on the river.
Exactly. It controlled the Hudson River. If the British controlled the Hudson, they would physically split the New England colonies off from the rest of the country, likely ending the rebellion.
But Arnold was carrying a lot of baggage. He felt deeply unappreciated by Congress. He was stung by a formal reprimand from Washington over some shady financial issues. And he was heavily influenced by his young wife, Peggy Shippen, who had very strong loyalist ties in Philadelphia.
Right. There were a lot of factors pushing him.
So Arnold hatches this plot to sell the plans for West Point to the British for a massive payout. How exactly did this treason unravel? Because the timing is just pure cinematic tension.
The mechanics of the discovery were incredibly lucky for the Americans. Arnold was secretly communicating with a British intelligence officer named Major John Andre. Andre had sailed up the Hudson to meet Arnold in person and finalize the plans.
Okay.
But on his way back to the British lines wearing civilian clothes, Andre was stopped by 3 American militiamen. They searched him and found the detailed plans to West Point stuffed inside his boots.
And the timing of this is unbelievable. George Washington is literally on his way to West Point for a scheduled breakfast meeting with Benedict Arnold. Just moments before Washington arrives at the house, Arnold gets word that John Andre has been captured.
Arnold instantly realizes he is entirely exposed. The plans in Andre's boots are in his handwriting. He rushes upstairs, confesses the plot to his wife Peggy, abandons her and their infant child, and escapes down the river to a waiting British ship, the Vulture.
So he just bolts.
Just runs. The captured documents are couriered to Washington later that afternoon. When Washington reads them and realizes what Arnold has done, the sources say he is just shattered. He turns to the Marquis de Lafayette and with tears in his eyes, he says, Arnold has betrayed us. Whom can we trust now?
Oh, wow.
It took a profound emotional toll. It sent shockwaves of deep paranoia through the entire Continental Army high command. If Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, a man who had bled for the revolution, could be bought, well, the fear was that literally anyone could be a traitor.
But we also have to talk about Peggy Shippen's role in the immediate aftermath, because it is a masterclass in deception.
Oh, Peggy Shippen's theatrical masterpiece.
Yeah, historical evidence strongly suggests she was deeply involved in the conspiracy, likely facilitating the encrypted communications between Arnold and the British. But when Washington and Alexander Hamilton arrive at the house and discover the treason, she realizes she is in massive danger. She's alone with the top American commanders, so she feigns a complete hysterical mental breakdown.
She is pacing the halls in a minimal morning gown, raving wildly, weeping over her baby, claiming there are hot irons on her head.
She completely duped the American high command. Hamilton was practically writing poetry in his letters about her distress, totally convinced of her absolute innocence.
Right, they completely bought it.
They felt so sorry for her that they gave her a safe escort back to her family. It's a stunning piece of self-preservation.
Washington survives the Morristown winter, the mutinies, the near loss of his home, and the ultimate betrayal of his best general. But all of this psychological and economic torture proves to him that the Continental Army cannot survive another year of this stalemate.
The clock is ticking.
The clock is finally ticking on the revolution itself. He desperately needs a decisive victory, which forces him to evolve as a diplomat.
Which brings us to the pivot. May 1781, the Wethersfield Conference in Connecticut. Washington meets with the Comte de Rochambeau, who is the commander of the French expeditionary force that had finally arrived in America.
They need a joint campaign strategy.
Right. Now, Washington is absolutely obsessed with attacking the British stronghold in New York City. He believes retaking New York is the only way to strike a fatal blow and relieve pressure on the southern states.
But Rochambeau secretly thinks attacking New York is a terrible, suicidal idea.
Really?
Yeah, New York is too heavily fortified, and the large French warships cannot navigate the shallow waters of the harbor. Rochambeau prefers heading south, to the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, where the British are more exposed.
Okay.
And this is where Washington shows immense diplomatic growth. In the past, he might have been stubborn. But here, instead of pilling rank on his coalition partner, he listens.
He swallows his pride. Because on August 14th, word arrives that the French Admiral de Grasse is sailing 29 massive warships from the West Indies up to the Chesapeake, bringing 3,000 extra French troops.
A massive reinforcement.
Washington looks at the board and realizes the overwhelming naval superiority he has been begging for is going to be in Virginia, not New York. And he has a very tight window because Admiral de Grasse sends word he can only stay until mid-October before he has to return to the Caribbean.
So Washington pivots the entire Allied army south.
But pivoting the army creates a massive logistical and strategic nightmare. Washington has to march an entire combined army 400 miles south without British General Clinton, who is sitting in New York with a massive force, noticing and attacking their exposed flank as they march.
So Washington essentially gaslights the entire British High Command.
Let's look at the mechanics of this deception because it is brilliant. How do you hide an army's movement in the 18th century?
You give the enemy exactly what they expect to see. To freeze General Clinton in New York, Washington orders his troops to build massive brick bread ovens in their camps in New Jersey.
Because building permanent brick ovens implies you are going to be baking bread for a massive army over a very long period of time. It signals a long-term encampment and an imminent siege of Manhattan.
Exactly. They also set up huge fake military camps. They built boats mounted on wheels to make it look like they were preparing for an amphibious assault across the waters into New York.
That's so clever.
Washington even drafted fake battle plans detailing the imminent attack on the city and purposefully leaked them, sending them via couriers he knew would be intercepted by British spies.
It works perfectly. Clinton is just sitting in New York, paralyzed, preparing his defenses, waiting for an attack that is never coming, while the Franco-American army quietly slips away and marches south.
But the march south nearly fails anyway, not because of British interference, but because of the bankrupt treasury we discussed earlier.
Right, the money issue again.
When the American troops reach Oakton, Maryland, they are exhausted. Their uniforms are in tatters and they're still unpaid. They flat out refuse to go any further. They're teetering on the edge of mutiny yet again. Robert Morris, the American Superintendent of Finance, realizes the treasury is completely empty. There's no money to pay them.
So the entire climactic march of the American Revolution is about to grind to a halt in Maryland. How did they solve a bankrupt treasury in the middle of a military campaign?
They were saved by a financial miracle orchestrated by the Spanish. Admiral de Grasse, before sailing north to the Chesapeake, had stopped in Havana, Cuba. He met with a Spanish official named Francisco Saavedra de Sangronis.
Okay.
De Grasse explained that the Americans were broke and the campaign would collapse without hard currency. In just 24 hours, Saavedra de Sangronis managed to raise up to 1.2 million silver pesos from the private citizens and merchants of Havana.
De Grasse brings this massive haul of Spanish silver to the mainland and hands it over to Robert Morris in September. The detail in the sources that completely blows my mind is the physical weight of this money.
Oh, the floorboards, right?
Yes. They stored the silver coins in a house in Williamsburg, Virginia, and the sheer weight of the silver literally collapsed the floorboards of the house.
Paying the Continental soldiers in actual hard currency. Well, for many of them, it was the first real money they'd seen since 1776. It instantly restored morale. It kept the army intact for that final crucial push into Virginia.
With the troops paid and General Clinton successfully duped in New York, the trap was perfectly set for British General Cornwallis.
Which brings us to the climactic strike. The Siege of Yorktown, September to October 1781. The Allied forces finally converge. Over 16,000 Franco-American troops completely surround Cornwallis and his 8,000 British men on the Virginia Peninsula.
And out in the water, the massive French fleet is blockading the seas, so Cornwallis cannot be evacuated or resupplied. He's completely trapped.
The battle that followed was a textbook 18th century European siege, heavily directed by French engineering experts. A siege isn't just a chaotic charge, it is a highly mathematical, slow-moving strangulation.
Yeah, they use trenches.
The Allied forces dug what are called parallel trenches. They would dig a trench parallel to the British defenses, set up their heavy artillery, and bombard the British lines. Then, under the cover of darkness, they would dig a zigzag trench forward, create a second parallel trench closer to the British line, move the cannons up, and start again.
Digging trenches at night while British artillery is firing blindly into the dark trying to hit you? The sensory experience of that must have been terrifying. And on October 9th, when the first Allied batteries were finally complete, Washington made a highly symbolic gesture. He personally touched the match to the first artillery gun, initiating the bombardment.
But to finish the siege, the Allied forces had to physically take out 2 detached earthen forts that were jutting out and blocking their path for the final trench. These were known as Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10.
Okay.
Washington orders a synchronized high-risk infantry assault on a moonless night, October 14th. The French are assigned to take Redoubt 9. But Redoubt 10, well, that assault is commanded by Washington's former aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton leads 400 American light infantrymen in a truly daring attack. And let's look at the mechanics of this, because it highlights the sheer psychological terror of the moment. To maintain total silence and surprise, Hamilton ordered his men to attack with unloaded muskets.
They couldn't risk a soldier accidentally tripping, firing a shot, and giving away their position in the dark. They had to rely purely on the steel of their bayonets.
Unloaded muskets. You are walking in the pitch black toward a fortified enemy position, knowing you cannot fire back if you are spotted. They sprinted across the open ground, hacked through the wooden defenses, and overran the fort in under 10 minutes. It's wild.
It really is an incredible feat. And that successful assault seals Cornwallis's fate. His defensive perimeter completely collapses. He realizes further resistance is just a massacre, and on October 19, 1781, the British Army marches out to surrender.
The surrender ceremony itself was fraught with deep diplomatic tension. The British military band is reportedly playing a tune called The World Turned Upside Down, which perfectly captured the moment.
Absolutely.
And the British second-in-command General Charles O'Hara, who was acting for Cornwallis, who claimed he was too sick to attend the ceremony, tries to publicly snub the Americans.
Oh, yeah, he walks right past George Washington and tries to hand the sword of surrender to the French commander Rochambeau. He essentially tries to say, we are surrendering to the mighty French Empire, not these colonial rebels.
But Rochambeau shakes his head and points O'Hara back to Washington.
And Washington, adhering strictly to the rigid military protocol of the era, refuses to accept a sword from a subordinate officer. Since Cornwallis sent his second-in-command, Washington points O'Hara to his own second-in-command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln.
Oh, that's great.
It was a firm, unyielding enforcement of American legitimacy on the world stage.
But there's a much darker side to the surrender negotiations regarding the British loyalists who were trapped inside Yorktown with the British Army. Because the surrender meant that British military protection for loyalists outside of New York City was entirely gone.
This leads to a period known as the Loyalist Terror. During the surrender negotiations, Cornwallis tried to insert Article 10 into the treaty. This article would have granted blanket amnesty to the American loyalists who fought with the British, protecting them from punishment.
Okay.
Washington flat out rejected it. He viewed these loyalists as domestic traitors who were subject to civil prosecution by the state governments.
I have to push back a little here. Does Washington just let them all be executed by vengeful mobs? That seems incredibly harsh even for him, especially right at the moment of ultimate victory.
He doesn't let them be slaughtered. No. And this is where we see a very pragmatic, unspoken compromise. While Washington maintained his uncompromising public stance against amnesty, he quietly allowed Cornwallis the use of the British sloop Bonetta.
Oh, the Bonetta loophole.
Right. The agreement was that the Bonetta would carry official British dispatches to New York uninspected by American forces. It secretly allowed the most compromised loyalists, along with American deserters who would have been hanged, to be smuggled onto the ship and sail to safety. It prevented a horrific post-surrender massacre while allowing Washington to maintain his legal and moral posture.
So he stepped back from the surrender field, the documents are signed. The reverberations of this single event just shatter the political realities across the Atlantic. In America, you have this instant transformation. The populace goes from bitter, starving, economically depressed, war weariness to just euphoric celebration.
Washington himself viewed the victory not just as a military triumph, but as a divine miracle. He issued general orders to the army, calling the outcome an astonishing interposition of providence.
I mean, from his perspective, he had spent 3 years managing starvation, hyperinflation, mutiny, and treason, and suddenly the unlikely convergence of French navies, a massive influx of Spanish silver, and perfectly timed logistics delivers the ultimate victory.
But over in London, the reaction is the exact opposite. Prime Minister Lord North gets the news of Yorktown, throws his arms wide and exclaims, "Oh God, it is all over."
Parliament quickly realizes the war in America is both financially ruinous and militarily impossible to win now. They eventually force Lord North to resign, but King George III is in a state of absolute stubborn denial.
He firmly believes that losing America will trigger the unraveling of the entire British Empire. That if America falls, they'll lose the West Indies, they'll lose Ireland, they'll lose everything.
The sources show he is in such deep despair that he actually secretly drafts a letter of abdication. He's ready to resign the crown and hand the throne over to the Prince of Wales entirely over this defeat.
He eventually stays on, but it shows just how devastating the psychological impact of Yorktown really was to the British monarchy.
If we synthesize this entire 3-year period, the core truth is that Yorktown wasn't just a brilliant tactical win that came out of nowhere. It was the direct result of surviving 3 years of intense psychological and economic torture.
Exactly. Washington broke the will of the British crown, not by outfighting them in the north, but by simply refusing to let the Continental Army disintegrate under the crushing weight of hyperinflation, brutal winters, and betrayal.
Well, thank you for guiding us through the intricate mechanics of this incredibly intense period of history. It really highlights how precarious the whole experiment was and how lucky it was that these disparate, fracturing colonial forces had a single figure with the gravity of Washington to act as a central pillar holding it all together.
It was a pleasure. The sheer endurance required to navigate the logistics and the human suffering of that era is truly staggering to think about.
But I want to leave everyone listening with a final provocative thought to mull over. Think about that massive haul of Spanish silver from Havana, the silver that literally collapsed the floorboards in Williamsburg. It saved the Continental Army from a crippling mutiny just days before the climactic siege of Yorktown began.
Yeah, that silver was crucial.
It begs the question, did America actually win its independence through sheer grit and ideals, or did it essentially buy it on credit from a foreign empire at the exact final hour? Because if that silver hadn't arrived, the American Revolution might have ended not with a glorious surrender ceremony and the world turned upside down, but with a bankrupt, starving army simply putting down their weapons and walking home. It makes you realize that sometimes winning the giant game of chicken depends entirely on someone else's wallet keeping your eyes open. Until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive with us.